Hi, it's Liz. I am back again 2 days in a row because I want to get this out of the way. Somebody asked me the difference between stigma for bipolar disorder versus like Asperger's autism and, like my take. I've been thinking about this question ever since, and that was probably over a month ago. And I keep thinking I'm going to wait until I have the energy to do a much better video, but that's probably not realistic. Please support my Patreon. As it is, I'm busy. I'm a mother of a toddler. Um, I'm dealing with disability issues. So if you want to help my capacity to put out information about mental health and everything else that I like to talk about, the link is in the description. I'm going to be putting out another video tomorrow on Thursday because I put out a video every Thursday. So that's also something you can look forward to if you subscribe. I want to say a few disclaimers for this video. This should be obvious, but I feel like it still needs to be said that, my perspective about the stigmas of bipolar disorder and autism it's only my own perspective. My perspective is not all encompassing or universal. They're very much based on my biases and my experiences, which are specific to me. I have bipolar 1. With the autism spectrum, I honestly feel awkward even like sort of coming out and I talking about that sense of like identifying with that because I am so far from being the stereotype. And I there are a lot of autistic symptoms that I don't sort of obviously display, or maybe don't really experience, or don't experience very often, or don't experience in an extreme way that a lot of other autistics do. And so, of course, my perspective is going to be colored by that. However, I do experience plenty of autistic symptoms, and some of them I do experience in an extreme way. They just don't tend to be the things that are visible. Like, I mean, shutdowns and meltdowns, for instance, are very visible, and I'll link some good videos about what those are below. But it's not something that has tended to happen to me in public. It's not something that, like, just from meeting me, you would realize that that's something that happens. But it does. And yeah. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from with that. So I'm gonna break this question up into two parts because now I was thinking about this issue of stigma, and I think stigma around these conditions comes in two different ways. On the one hand, there's the connotations that people have when you say those words, when you say the word bipolar, or you say autistic or Asperger's, if they even know what that means at all. There's a lot of things that will pop into their head of like, oh, that's what that means, and then they'll sort of react to you / the connotation. And then there's the whole other thing of the actual behavior, the behavioral symptoms, and how people react to those without necessarily having the context of knowing that you're bipolar or autistic. So I think, yeah, these are two very distinct things. So I'm going to start with connotations. And I'm going to start with bipolar disorder. So the connotations of bipolar disorder are, on the one hand, that you're a crazy person, you're maybe unreliable. That's a big one. And not just unreliable, like, oh, maybe you're not going to show up for work on time or whatever, which, guilty. Um, I'm bad at that kind of thing. Although I think that's more of an autism spectrum thing. Um, but also unreliable in terms of like an unreliable narrator of your own life, which is a kind of a some nuance that you can get into there, right? Because when you are manic or depressed, and especially psychotic, yeah, there are some reliability issues with your narrative, but that can be pushed. I think people's perspective about how unreliable somebody who's bipolar is can be pretty extreme. So I'll talk about that in a sec. So yeah, they see you as unreliable. They see you as um, unstable, which of course you can be, and I have been many times, but that's not necessarily true. There's also the issue of people kind of starting to project your symptoms onto you. How do I say this? Inappropriately or inaccurately. They're like, "Oh, you're very happy. You must be manic, you know. Oh, you're bummed out. Oh, you must be depressed." Would be kind of the classic. But, more than that too, like, say you have a suspicion or concern about something. People might say, "Oh, you must be getting paranoid." Which of course all those things might be true. Those might be accurate reads of you, but they also might not be. And a lot of the time people have kind of a simplistic idea of what those kinds of symptoms like mania and depression and paranoid thinking actually look like. Because just because somebody is raising a concern about something doesn't mean they're paranoid when they're doing it. And often a discerning eye can tell the difference. It's not necessarily just like this mystery. That there's a difference in the way that somebody might express themselves, the ways that people talk when they're actually manic and paranoid versus when they're simply suspicious or concerned or accusing somebody of something or whatever it is. So yeah, people lack that kind of discernment. Again, also same thing with like happiness and mania. Mania has a very distinctive quality. It doesn't necessarily present as happiness, but when it does, it's definitely distinctive. If you've seen it, you'll know the difference between a manic happy and a normal happy, even a normal very happy, very enthusiastic, very energetic. Mania is something a little bit more than all those things, a little bit beyond those things. And I talk about some of this stuff in my video about bipolar misconceptions. So I'll link that below. So yeah, so those are some of the kinds of connotations. People also have the connotation of people who are bipolar being dangerous. And I think there's a few reasons for this. On the one hand, of course, there's media representations, which have a profound impact on how people view mental illness. And there's this great video about this that I'll also link below. So you can watch that because they really did a good job, I think, looking at some of these tropes. But especially when it comes to, yeah, people who are bipolar or really anybody who has a psychotic illness, people might see as being scary because of these kinds of media tropes. And of course, again, nuance, there's times when people who are psychotic can be scary. But it's not like the movies. It's not like people think. I'll leave that at that. I talk about that a little bit more in my bipolar story, the middle section, which I'll also link. Man, there's going to be a lot of videos down there. Another Another connotation people have with bipolar, especially with bipolar women, especially with young bipolar women, um, is this kind of sexy, like literally manic pixie dream girl kind of, yeah, sexy bipolar chick, um, or sexy bipolar guy, charming bipolar guy, because people who are manic can be very, very, very charming and very exciting and very fun to spend time with and very creative and very glamorous. So that comes from a real place, but it's also a damaging way to look at people, if only because it's kind of objectifying, especially and romanticizing of their illness. Um, which there's yet another video about romanticizing mental illness that I'll include in the description. Oh yeah, but I forgot to get back to the scary bit, the bipolar scary bit. I think there's another reason for this, and I think it's because, a lot of and I'm saying this from very painful, like anecdotal experience. I don't know if this is really a thing. But from anecdotal experience from people I know and people I've seen in message boards and stuff, a lot of people have the association with bipolar disorder and abusive men, like men who commit domestic violence. And it's true, I think, that many men who are guilty of domestic violence do have that diagnosis of bipolar. I kind of question the validity of that, though, and I'm not saying that obviously people with bipolar can be abusive. I'm not trying to like say we're all angels or something. But bipolar disorder is really, really often misdiagnosed. It's a diagnosis that doctors love to give because bipolar disorder is, in theory, pretty easy to treat. But there are several things that the outward manifestations are often confused. And these are conditions that I think the internal experience of them, the internal experience of actually going through manic depressive cycles, and the internal experience of, for example, having borderline personality disorder is very different. When I hear people with BPD talking about what it's like for them to navigate in the world, I'm just like, I can't relate. But some of their outward behavior can seem similar, especially to providers who, the way the mental health system works, a lot of people, even with severe mental illnesses, don't spend a lot of time with the same providers. So you see somebody who observes you for, as little as, a few minutes or, a few hours, and then jumps to all these conclusions and gives you a diagnosis. And then you have that diagnosis label slapped on you and somebody else gets you. They can contextualize all their observations of you with that diagnosis, and they might only see you again for a couple minutes, couple hours, maybe a couple days if you're on hold in a mental health facility. But it's very easy to have many breakdowns without having a stable provider who's really seeing you on a regular basis and talking to you and is good enough at their jobs to be able to start discerning between, not just looking at what you're doing, but starting to understand why you're doing it, and how your behaviors fit together into cycles, how they're triggered, blah, blah, blah. So I think that I can see how the misdiagnosis would happen when, you barely see providers, or you don't have good providers. But BPD and bipolar disorder are very different things. There's for both, there's like these issues of impulsivity, possibly, suicidal ideation or suicide attempts, that kind of thing. There might be depression for BPD. A lot of BPD people have depression and anxiety, as do a lot of people with bipolar disorder. there's just a lot of outward similarities, but they're very different. And especially for men, a lot of men will like just never be diagnosed as borderline personality disorder, even if that's really the diagnosis that would fit them best, if everybody was being honest and unbiased and they had good providers who were really spending a lot of time with them. Borderline personality disorder, as I understand it, is motivated by this kind of emotional core, fears of abandonment, and real confusion around emotional attachment. And it makes sense to me that men with borderline personality disorder would have a lot of trouble in relationships, which is obviously a charitable way to put it. But I can see how that would lead to abusive behavior, and I know that it often does. And I'm not trying to say this to judge people with borderline personality disorder at all. Culpability and mental illness is a really tricky thing that I'm not touching in this video. However, it's been my personal experience with people with BPD, as it's been many people's personal experience, that they do tend to play out abusive patterns in their relationships with people. It sounds like that's probably because that's the way they learned to deal with emotional attachment from, very, very early on in their lives. So again, I'm not blaming anybody or trying to stigmatize their illness. But that's something that happens. Anyway, my point is now that has really been projected onto bipolar disorder. Like, I've definitely had a number of people that I've told, like, I'm bipolar, and they're like, oh, like my abusive ex, and they're like, and then they get to know me and they're like, oh, you're not like that. Like, yeah, well, I don't know what to tell you. I'm not your abusive ex. And sadly, I know somebody whose partner was at least, diagnosed bipolar, who murdered her. It's not somebody I knew super well, but it was the sister of a close friend of mine. And that's, I have no words for that. And I absolutely understand why her family would have a hard time. I mean, I feel very, how do I put this? I feel very grateful that they're not projecting those feelings onto me, because they also know I'm bipolar. But I wouldn't blame them if they did, frankly. So yeah, that's bipolar. Those are the kind of connotations that people have. And I'm gonna get back to that question of unreliability in another video, because I think it deserves its own video. But yeah. So, there's a lot of stigma in those connotations. For sure. There's a lot of assumptions people make. However, I'd also like to say that, as far as I can tell, usually when I disclose that I'm bipolar to somebody, I actually don't get as much of a negative reaction as I'm actually even expecting. And maybe it's just people are being nice. I don't know. But I think bipolar disorder is something that has been brought to the fore, and people are starting to destigmatize somewhat and understand more about the disorder. So I feel like I don't actually experience that much sort of judgment just based on people knowing I'm bipolar. Okay. Now for autism/Asperger's. Let me just say that most people have never heard of Asperger's. If they have, they're probably pretty like competent on the subject. So I don't feel like there's like a ton of quote unquote stigma around Asperger's. That's just my experience. But for autism, like you say the word autism, what do people think of? I think people kind of imagine like some nonverbal little white boy who's in a fetal position in the corner, like rocking, you know? Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, and there certainly are autistic people that are pretty well described by that. But, um, you know, the autistic community, especially, um, yeah, the autistic community is really diverse, actually. And, autism, like bipolar disorder, is not really defined by behavioral characteristics or traits. Um, I mean, those are kind of signs to look deeper, but they're not really defined that way. They're defined by stuff that's going on in your brain. And particularly for autism, it's really about the sort of the structure of your brain, how your brain works on a very basic level, on a very fundamental level. Just yeah, how your brain processes things. Um, and so the specifics can vary in terms of what traits people have and the degree to which people have all those traits, and then how it actually looks, how it's actually expressed by them in ways that are visible to other people. There's so much variation there. And there are certain stereotypes that they certainly describe many people. They like most stereotypes, they do exist for a reason. However, you you know people I think are very, very rigid in their ideas about autism, to the point that one of the reasons I don't like disclosing it is not because people will see me in a bad light exactly for being autistic, but rather that people will see me as not being autistic, and for some reason trying to appropriate that as some kind of way to get attention or something. And that doesn't really that's it's just not helpful to me. I mean, it sucks to be invalidated, but it's kind of more like I don't get anything out of that interaction, so why would I have it? Um so I That's one reason I didn't disclose to people for many, many years. I think there's also this idea that being autistic is necessarily totally debilitating. And that's a really tricky issue. There's a lot of nuance to be had about that, because like I mean, on the one hand, it's not like it's necessarily de- it's not necessarily debilitating for everybody. Many autistic people do all kinds of amazing things all the time. Like that awesome little girl, Greta Grunberg. I don't know. I forget her name, but she's so cool. She's the one who's I want to say Danish, Finnish. I don't know. I'll look it up later. But she's doing all of this protesting um, for climate change, and she's, you know, going to these meetings of fancy international bigwigs and like browbeating them for, murdering everybody with their policies. And it's pretty cool, you know. Um, and there's a lot to be said about how her autism affects the way that she thinks about the world, and led to her choice to do that in the first place. And so that's a really positive thing, you might say, that autistic people, we tend to really question things, and feel we tend not to absorb as much of the culture around us, which is a good and a bad thing. But part of the good part is that it's easier for us to just transcend it, or just say, no, that doesn't make sense, I'm not doing that, when most people will just unthinkingly do that thing. So that's cool, right? At the same time, you know, there's two kind of pitfalls of talking about autistic people being as not being debilitated. One, or there's three. Again, one, there's people who really are unable to do very much at all, um, because of their autism. So that's real. Another thing is that it kind of becomes this inspiration porn thing. We want to, you know, hold up these autistic people in a way that's kind of fetishizing and romanticizing, and then part of the problem with that in turn is that it leads to that third thing, which is it lets neurotypical people off the hook for really accommodating people who are autistic, which is a really important thing. I mean, even those of us who are quote unquote very high functioning, like me, um, can could still be thriving a lot more in life, be doing a lot better, be contributing more to society, and just be happier and healthier if we were given accommodations that, in general, someone like me is treated like I don't need. And people who are quote unquote low functioning tend to be, well, their voice and their needs tend not to be heard at all, which is really sad. And they tend to be sort of forced to mimic normal people as much as possible with no regard for, what they actually need to be their best selves. And that might not sound like such a horrible thing, but it really is, especially if you start reading like some of these autism mommy blogs. Like, they're horrendous. There are people who are out there pouring bleach down their children's throats because they think that's going to cure their autism. Kids that are getting locked in closets and having all of these punishments designed for them if they don't jump through all these hoops so that they can look as non-autistic as possible, but just because people are too embarrassed to have a kid that's non-normative, or too scared that a non-normative kid will have a pointless life. I mean, that's what they say, and I'm not saying that I don't understand that concern somewhat as a parent, but I kind of tend to think that culture is more animated by a fear of sort of being embarrassed by their offspring, that their offspring are not going to live up to the dreams they had for them, because, like most parents, they project all of these expectations and dreams that they had for themselves onto their kids. And this is something that is hurting young, quote unquote, low functioning autistics immensely. There are people who, it's not hard to find if you want to start Googling about autism parents and the kind of books they write and the blogs they have, but it's not hard to find people who are justifying murdering autistic children as being a kind of mercy killing, or because it's just so hard to deal with somebody who's melting down and stuff all the time. Don't get me started on that. I do understand that it's hard, but there's a lot that their attitude does to make it worse, because, like I said in the first place, they're more focused on trying to make their kids normal than they are on trying to actually understand their children's needs. And the more their needs are ignored, the more they're going to lash out, the more they're going to be having meltdowns that are maybe violent, So, takes two to tango, guys. Anyway, I'm kind of off on a tangent. So, the difference I want to highlight here between these connotation stigmas is that, well, people are kind of weirded out by bipolar disorder, potentially. Either weirded out, or they're kind of like, ooh, sexy, or they're like, ooh, scary. There isn't kind of an underlying desire to annihilate bipolar people. With autism, there is. There are whole organizations that are basically like socially acceptable, I guess, because it's not like they're hiding. Like Autism Speaks, their whole thing is annihilating autism. They don't want autistic people to exist. They're eugenicists against autism. Like that's the whole thing, you know. People talking about murdering their children and you know being willing to not vaccinate them, uh, risking them having and spreading fatal diseases so that they don't have autism. This is how virulent the hatred is of autistic people. So let that sink in for a sec. Again, the other part of it is, I think, like I said, it seems like with bipolar disorder, even though people do have these connotations, I don't feel like they're that rigid. Like I think that a lot of people do have somewhat more, like kind of have maybe a few representations in their head of like what bipolar is and what bipolar people could be like. Um, and that's not so true with autism. Most people kind of basically have one caricature in their mind, and that's basically it. So those are two huge differences. Now, onto the behaviors, and we're going to notice a similar pattern. So, spoiler, yeah, it's similar. So, with bipolar disorder, the kinds of stuff that, like being depressed, being manic, being psychotic, and the behaviors that come along with that, the way that people tend to, I mean, there are a lot of unhelpful ways people respond to those, but the kind of responses that I've experienced to a lot of that behavior, I mean, at worst, it's dehumanizing. And I've talked about this in some of the videos. Again, check out the My Bipolar Story 2 that I have posted. Yeah, I mean, it can be horrible. It was really traumatizing for me to deal with that. In general, like when you're not psychotic and when you're not in a mental health setting, um, like in a mental hospital or something, because there's a lot of people there who I think just have compassion fatigue, and it shows, and it is traumatizing. But in general, I mean, people just kind of react to you like you're crazy. They just kind of they see you and they're like, you're a crazy person if you're manic or psychotic, which is kind of true. I mean, it's not wrong. I mean, it might be a bit of a dismissive or somewhat dehumanizing way to think about somebody who's having a mental health issue, and that's a problem. That is a real problem, like for sure. I'm not trying to be dismissive about that, because that does real harm to people, and it's very common. You see people kind of like joke about crazy people, joke about people having crazy conspiracy theories and saying crazy stuff, and oh ha ha ha, or joke about psychotic killers, or stuff like that. And it's not something that like like greatly emotionally upsets me, but it sucks. Like it does damage people with mental illnesses, and those attitudes are real and they're pretty pervasive. So it's not nothing. um and again, I'm just talking about responses to behavior, because this isn't necessarily once people kind of make the leap that like, oh, that person who's saying crazy stuff over there might actually be bipolar, I think it kind of forces them to realize that they're a person with an illness. Whereas when you just see them as a crazy person who's babbling about stuff, I think it's very easy just to laugh at them or to whatever. And that's why people who are, displaying some level of psychosis and mania are really vulnerable to violent attack, because they're dehumanized. They're just crazy people. They're just garbage crazy people. So they're not really people. And as for depression, I mean, I think bipolar depression is much like other clinical depression. Well, a lot of times people don't really see it. They don't understand. They might think you're just tired or just lazy. Um, People tend not to be very helpful. People tend to blame you for having thoughts of self-harm or that kind of thing. You know, there's definitely some stigma. However, depression stigma is something that like advocates have been working hard at for a few decades, and I think it's really gotten somewhere. I don't think depression stigma is anywhere nearly as bad as it used to be. So, yeah. As for autistic behaviors, most people have no context for autistic behaviors. And when, in my experience, when I display autistic traits, when I, and this is usually in moments where I no longer have the ability to mask them. Um, yeah, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about where I'm out of mental energy and the thing is just happening. So it might be that I'm having a shutdown would be the big thing, having a shutdown or getting burnout or kind of on the edge of like a meltdown or a shutdown or something like that. And what that winds up looking like, for example, one thing it can wind up looking at like is I suddenly won't really be able to talk, or it will take me a while to respond to somebody when they say something. Um, Not because I'm not listening, but because I can't process the words they're saying very, very quickly at all when there's a significant delay. And people tend to be angry, even other autistic people, because they don't necessarily put together that it's a symptom of something. They just see it as being rude. And there's a lot of stuff with autism that's like that. Like when I start having less mental energy to engage socially, I start getting awkward. I start, my timing winds up being off. I wind up saying stuff that's just kind of maybe comes off as creepy, or I don't say the thing that I'm supposed to say. And, that kind of thing. And I know that I'm just coming off badly. Sometimes I know that. Sometimes I'm oblivious to it. But either way, it comes off badly. It comes off as being rude. Another thing about, in a more pervasive way, dealing with autistic, my autism symptoms can mean that I just need a lot of downtime, and that I do things really slowly, because I really, like, if I try to do them more quickly, it won't work. I will just fail. And again, people tend to see those things as being intentional. And there's more, I think, of an understanding around something like depression. Not as much as there should be, but there's more of an understanding that when someone's deeply depressed, they might really struggle to get out of bed. They might really struggle to do basic self-care. I think as a culture, we're learning that this is true. But that kind of awareness is not there with autism, especially with, quote unquote, high functioning autism. People just see it as character flaws and you're not trying hard enough. And that is a really challenging thing to deal with, especially for somebody like me who I am very capable in the world in a lot of ways. But I also have limitations, and those limitations change depending on context, depending on what all is going on with me. So I have to manage my limitations, but also manage the expectations that others have of me, and try to set realistic challenges for myself, or scale things back and take care of myself, and that's always in flux. And it's just made a lot more challenging by the fact that a lot of people, it's just invisible to people, and you can tell them about it, and for the most part they're not going to believe you. Like, they might kind of smile and nod, but they're like, you're not really autistic though, because the kind of person they expect to be autistic. And you're not behaving in a stereotypically autistic way or whatever. So yeah, my experience with the behavioral stigma, just to kind of wrap it up, and to accentuate what I was saying, is people really react to my autistic symptoms when they rear their heads at people. These symptoms, people tend to react with, I mean, kind of visceral rage. Like at the most extreme. I mean, people react with a lot more venom than ever makes sense to me. And I'm not blaming them for it. It's not a, this is not accusing people of anything, but it just truly doesn't really make sense to me why people are so incensed by those things. And I think, in general, autistic personalities and autistic behaviors, to the extent that they are non-normative and to the extent that they're not masked, are things that tend to just upset people. They just really upset non-autistic people. And this kind of feeds back into the issue of caregivers for autistic people, autistic children in particular, just constantly being at the verge of homicide. I mean, sometimes, not to paint with too broad of a brush, but there are people who write about this. I mean, I'm not making this up. There are people who write about how they're, they want to kill the person that they're a caregiver for because they're just so pushed to the brink by these autistic traits. So that's a big difference. Again, and I'm not saying any of this to minimize bipolar stigma. Like, I just actually wrote this whole thing to a bunch of, I went to an event a month or two ago, where I noticed quite a few sort of ableist things that happened at the event with regard to, how people were talking about and joking about and referencing psychotic symptoms in people without, of course, using those words. And, like, I wrote them a whole thing about what I saw and what was damaging about it, and, what I thought maybe they could do to change that in the future. So I do think those things are important. I wouldn't have done that if I didn't think it was important. However, if you're going to compare the two, I think autism, like, it's autism that has a much further way to go in terms of really being something that's included, something that people think about, something that people recognize as real or really understand what it is. And just in terms of people's visceral reactions to it. I mean, dehumanization is bad, but I think the dehumanization of autistic people, especially the more severely disabled autistic children, is a really, really horrible problem. So, yeah. I hope that this is helpful. I'm really curious if anybody who's on the spectrum or bipolar, or like ideally both, has any thoughts about this that are whatever, similar to my thoughts, different. I'm curious to hear what you have to say, and I'm curious about your perspective because I can only speak from mine. So please hit me up in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah. All right. See you guys tomorrow when I post something or other. I haven't figured it out yet. Bye.